Hello, I'm Sarah Crompton, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this week's special edition of the WhatsOnStage podcast with the producer Julian Bird and the writer and biographer Oliver Soden, who wrote the biography of Nol Coward called Masquerade, which came out to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Coward's death. Or to mark, probably is more accurate. And the reason we're gathered together really is to bring that anniversary, which has run over 2 years, to a conclusion. And Julian, you are about to mount a huge gala on November 17th, which will celebrate Nol Coward. So do you want to tell me a bit about that to begin with, and then we'll spin off into different things?
Yeah, I think the word is celebration. I think that is the accurate word. Coward is one of still the most performed writers in the English canon, if you like, and we'll probably talk about his relevance, but in one sense never more relevant. And even in the last year, you've seen numerous productions, both in the UK and around the world. And it seemed the perfect opportunity to try and celebrate his work, his life. And also, if you like, celebrate, in terms of raising money for some charities, some of the things that he cared pretty passionately about, the acting community and acting for others. Obviously, the Nol Coward Foundation exists to help young people, young performers have a step up in life. And of course, his whole passion for literature, which with the Queen's Reading Room. So, we're raising money for these three extraordinary charities. And as you said, if I go back to sort of more my youth or my early days, the West End was full of these kind of big all-star Sunday night galas, and they're almost never done anymore, partly because, believe me, the logistics are horrific, as we're right in the middle of it. But when I was, Alan Brody and I started talking, 18 months ago about this and said, let's try and do it. And that's what we're doing, if you like, bringing together the most extraordinary group of British talent from across the ages, a lot of whom are very, very well known for their work with Coward's different plays, readings, songs, some that are new to it, right. And bringing them together to try and show, I don't want to just say his greatest hits, because there's a few little unknowns in there as well, which is always a good thing, to try and really bring together one night of demonstrating his greatness, really, across the many things he's done, not just the plays, but the writings and the poems and the songs and everything as well.
Yeah, name names on your performers, because you've got an extraordinary array. Daniel Evans is directing and Tom Brady is your music director, but you've got an astonishing lineup.
Yeah, we do. And it's one of those nights when I'm incredibly grateful that people have said yes. So, we have some of the great knights and dames of the British acting world, from Judi Dench, Ian McKellen and Derek Jacobi down, but also some great, younger talent in Marisha Wallace and some people who maybe haven't done some of this so much before. Cush Jumbo, who's in the Scottish play in the West End at the moment. We've got people that others will know, some we haven't even announced yet, some others as well, but Alfred Enoch. And what's been great is to see people's joy at being asked to do some of this as well. And there are some surprises on the night. We're not announcing everybody yet, and there will be one or two that I think people will love on the evening that we're just sort of holding back, as you often do for one of these things. So
yeah. And Oliver, you wrote the first Coward biography for something like 30 years, I think. Why do you think he is still significant? Why did you want to write about him and go back to examining his importance in British culture and British theatrical culture?
Well, the answer to that was different by the time I'd finished the book, in that I began it thinking, gosh, the author of Private Lives, Hay Fever, Blithe Spirit, all those great comedies that we all still know, he's worth another look. That wit is going to last forever and is still witty and still makes me laugh uproariously, and did when I was 11 years old and saw Lindsay Duncan and Alan Rickman do Private Lives in the West End. And then when I embarked upon the book, and by the time I'd finished it, I realized that there was so much more to it, far more than I'd realized, than simply dressing gowns and cigarette holders and witty retorts. There is all three of those things, and they're still wonderful, but I hadn't realized the extent to which all that humor hides an often very painful personality and worldview, but a very pertinent, relevant worldview about the great truths of love and class and sexuality and gender and living through wartime and peacetime. Coward is so deeply profound. But he's one of the very few profound playwrights who pretends not to be. You know, all the profundity gets in on the sly because he's so busy being so witty. But there is, as the gala will show, there is this enormous body of work. There are 50 plays, 9 musicals, volumes of poetry, screenplays, not all of which are comedies. There's a play set in the trenches of the First World War. There are speeches that are going to appear, I think, in the gala that he gave on the radio during the Second World War. There's deep, moving love poetry that some people think is by Auden until they're told it's by Noel Coward. There is a great deal to him, and the relevance lies in that, in what he has to say about life and how to live it, and that it is for living, but that's often quite a difficult thing.
It struck me that in a way, he is a man who is stuck with an image that isn't necessarily true, because I do remember that Lindsay Duncan play. I didn't see it. I remember looking at it in the papers and thinking, I really want to get to London and watch it, but I didn't manage to. So I suppose what I was left with, in a sense, was the Italian Job, you know, that sense of the man, you know, the master and the man in the dressing gown, and the slight parody of himself that did seem to be in place, certainly 30 years ago.
Well, I think that's what the gala is going to do very wonderfully, because we have all the national treasures doing Coward, but then, as Julian says, much, much younger actors in their 30s who either haven't seen that way of performing Coward, or certainly weren't old enough to ever see Coward performing Coward. So they only come to the text, and it is like cleaning a painting of dirty varnish and just seeing what the words are and realizing that there isn't one correct way to perform Nol Coward. If you throw yourself into him, forgetting all the preconceptions that you have, the plays are still reinventing themselves. They are withstanding new ways of doing it, new generations, styles of acting. They're withstanding it, more than withstanding it, they're flourishing. I mean, seeing Cush Jumbo wrestle and triumph with Noel Coward is going to be thrilling, I think.
Yeah. And Julian, how did you choose the material when there is so much to choose from? How have you managed to sort through it?
I have to say, it's been an amazing collaborative process between the 5 of us, so Oliver and myself, with Daniel Evans and Tom Brady, as you said, and of course, amazing expertise of Alan Brodie, who is the sort of guardian of the Coward estate and the licensor of all his work. And I guess between us, everyone has their little favourites and their little things. And as I said, you know, there's some unknown in there as well as the known. But Sarah, you and I know you've talked about this on other podcasts, you know, you and I were fortunate to do a project earlier in the year in the middle of the Atlantic with Cunard, where we did a Coward afternoon for the passengers on board a transatlantic liner. And in front of 1,200 people in one afternoon, we did a 45-minute kind of little thing like this as well. And I think what's extraordinary is particularly with some of his songs, they're almost as though they were written yesterday. It's amazing how relevant they still are. You know, there's a song called There Are Bad Times Just Around the Corner. And, you know, we sit here all talking in the middle of political turmoil in America, political turmoil in Britain, political turmoil in Europe. And almost that song could have been written yesterday. And it's sort of extraordinary how some people would view Coward's work as old-fashioned, and yet somehow it seems almost more relevant today than perhaps when it was even written. So, of course, in choosing material, we're trying to do some of those things that we think have particular relevance today. But, of course, we're also trying to do some extracts from some of his plays and some of his writings that are perhaps the things that people know the best. And you take something, we've mentioned Lindsay and the late Alan Rickman doing Private Lives, but, you know, Private Lives is perhaps the most, with Blithe Spirit, but Private Lives is one of the most performed Coward plays. Just within the last 12 months, we've had 2 productions of it in London, you know, one with Patricia Hodge and Nigel Havers and one at the John Marr Warehouse. How extraordinary is that, really? I can't think of another, absent Shakespeare, another playwright who's had the same play produced twice in the West End in the last 12 months. And so, of course, we're also kind of hitting some of that as well in the evening.
Yeah.
I also say that what we've managed to do, I think, is show a little bit of all of him, which is to say we've managed, I think, to get the comic playwright, the serious playwright, the diary keeper, the writer of screenplays, the poet, the songwriter, the lyricist, the composer. That is the challenge, in a way, that a multiplicity of talent. I mean, unmatched before or since, you might argue. And I think we've shown the range as well as the depth, which is important.
Yeah, I was very struck by, I think you quote it, Oliver, in the biography, by the T.S. Eliot quote about Coward, which is that there are things we can learn from Coward that we don't learn from Shakespeare. And that's interesting in the context of, our theatrical times. We see so much Shakespeare. There's so much sense of people returning over and over again to have a look what he can tell us. So what do you think are the things that Coward can tell us that maybe Shakespeare doesn't tell us now?
Gosh, what an amazing question. Isn't it extraordinary that you've just asked a question linking Noel Coward with T.S. Eliot and Shakespeare? Noel Coward, ostensibly this ephemeral, fripperous, comedic talent pitched against the great modernist and the greatest playwright of all time. And yet we have just linked the three of them in a triangle. I mean, I'd love to have asked T.S. Eliot what were the things that he thought were in Coward. And of course, he may well have been speaking architecturally. I mean, that impeccable technical craftsmanship that Coward has in building a play. I mean, sometimes with the greatest will in the world, you don't have that with Shakespeare when you're struggling with the scenes and so on. So that there may be an architectural point. But of course, one of the things Shakespeare couldn't do was tell us how to live in the 20th century, which sounds a very silly thing to say, but nevertheless, that is one of the key things that I think Coward did as a playwright. I mean, he sang the 20th century blues, that astonishing period that he lived through, right through the two world wars and the 50s and then into the 60s. And the way he charts what it meant to be young between the world wars, and then the continual self-reinvention, the getting through the Second World War, he's terribly good at being an antenna that tunes into shifting times. I mean, that to me is one of his great achievements, that he looks at the terrors and fears of the world and says, right, we need to come up with some new designs for living, which he often did, whether that's to do with homosexuality or living in trios, as in his play Design for Living, or a group, as in Present Laughter. I mean, whatever that is, he comes up with these new alternatives for what life can be when beyond the walls of the high society drawing rooms, life looks quite frightening.
Yeah. And I was very struck, Julian, I'd like to say it was a dry run for this gala, but it was really a wet run across the Atlantic for this gala. One of the songs you featured was A Marvellous Party. And because it's so well known, you tend to think, oh, this is just an incredibly funny song about life and party going. Whereas in fact, it's a really good example of the sort of man in the ironic mask. I mean, it's savage, really, in its accuracy of describing the emptiness of life and people and how they behave.
And I think Oliver alluded to this earlier. For me, Coward has this extraordinary ability to write something in whatever that song is, 3 minutes, which is incredibly humorous. I mean, when it's performed in a particular way, it's sort of belly-laughingly humorous. Yeah. But yet it has absolutely kind of biting satire at its heart and actually has something to say. And I suspect that's why Coward is still so performed today, actually, by people all around the world, because of that unique ability to do that, and the greatest songwriters, whether you're talking about rock and roll or pop or musical theatre or this genre, have the ability in 3 minutes to say something while also entertaining you. And there's no doubt that Coward had that ability. And I think that's probably why he stays one of the most performed people,
Well, that song is incredible, isn't it? There are two things in that there is an infolding of internal rhyme that is of a technical skill that I think, T.S. Eliot...
Extraordinary.
It's just, astounding. I think he leaves a lot of people far, far behind. And also, I think it's 1932, and it is yet 35 years until the legalization of homosexuality. And yet it is so evidently about cross-dressing homosexual couples. I mean, people talk about him hiding these coded, discrete references in double entendres. I mean, no, actually, it is deeply explicit about gay couples. And yet the daring, we're talking about going against theatrical censorship and criminal law. I mean, just the bravery of him and the proof of how much you can get away when you're being side-splittingly funny is amazing.
Yeah, and I think you do come back over and over again to that, that great run of plays in the 1920s that start him on his career, really, the 1924 success of The Vortex, and then the run that ends with Private Lives and contains Hay Fever and Blithe Spirit. Mm-hmm. All of those plays are so funny, and yet they are coruscating in the emptiness of relationships and people's fear of being alone. And I must say, as I watch Coward more now, and I've watched those revivals this year and last 2 years, if we look back at him, I feel that desperate sense of loneliness pervades the plays right from the start. Mm. Do you think that's true? I mean, do you think that is that? And it's there in the songs, isn't it? I mean, A Talent to Amuse is the saddest song in the whole world, I think.
It is, because after the admission of all I've had is just a talent to amuse, it goes on to say, if love were all, if only somebody splendid really needed me, cares would be ended if I knew that he wanted to have me near. I mean, this pining, wistful loneliness, which is partly autobiographical, it's partly the plight of the homosexual in the most of the 20th century. It's partly Coward's own plight, his own inability to love, to use his own phrase, I am no good at love. And it wasn't until his 40s that his personal life settled into a long and loving domestic relationship with another man. But also I think it speaks for a wider generation. As I say, it catches that feeling. You're spat out of the First World War with a pandemic behind you. I mean, talk about relevance, the Spanish flu, which Coward nearly died of in 1918. And then here we are 100 years later, looking back at this catastrophe and the First World War, and looking into the future as the young do now, and seeing nothing but impermanence and bleakness, and deciding that the thing to do is to laugh and make merry while you can. But you have to ask always with Coward, what is it in the lives of these characters that means they have to speak to one another with such lacerating, devastating wit? And what is it about your fear of the future that means, as in Private Lives, you can run away from your new partner on the spur of the moment and disappear? And, it's the let's do it, anything goes era, isn't it? To quote another great songwriter, it's the live while you can because life is short.
Yeah, and I do think there's a truthfulness in the writing that I don't think I noticed when I first came to Coward. I feel I've discovered that as I've watched more and more, and as different people revive different plays in new ways, really.
I think there came a time, whether Alan would like me saying this, when Coward was a little unfashionable, and where Coward's plays were produced were all in sort of summer reps and in a very sort of light-hearted, not terribly always brilliantly done way. And I think there was a time when that was people's perception of them, whereas actually I think what we've seen in the last few years, particularly in the West End, is a series of productions of his work that have, as you said, shown that darker side to it, in a good way. They've shown the depth of the work. And, someone I was privileged to work with a few times, Angela Lansbury, who gave that incredibly memorable last performance as Madame Arcati, first on Broadway and then here in the West End. To see people of stature and that talent, come and want to do Coward's plays, quite frankly, someone like Angela Lansbury at that point in her life could have literally done anything, but for her to say, actually, no, I want to do this and I'm going to spend years doing it between Broadway and the West End, and those plays suddenly being seen as serious pieces of work that absolutely continue to stand up in the West End and on the greatest stages in the world, I think is extraordinary, really. So for me, I think Coward is probably never more relevant and has come back into being seen as an incredibly important playwright. And, I know that there are all sorts of proposals and plans for his work going forward that are on the table. And so I think the next few years we're going to see that continue, actually.
It's interesting that we've just had this program at the Almeida of the so-called angry young men, plus one woman, but they were, it has to be said, mainly angry young men. John Osborne, Kingsley Amis, Arnold Wesker. They've been doing Wesker and Osborne at the Almeida. And it's interesting watching people having to now make quite the case that Osborne and Wesker are worth the revival. Whereas once in the 1950s, it was Coward and Terence Rattigan who were out in the cold because the future of the theatre was the angry political theatre of Osborne and Wesker. Now, the divide wasn't actually so neat, and Coward was a great influence on and supporter of many of the angry young men, even as he disliked some of their political ideas. But I think the point is that Coward, there is no better phrase for Noel Coward in the 1920s than the angry young man. And while we've got very used to what these plays are, because they are revived a lot, but in the 1920s, it was Coward's plays that had protests in the stalls and people heckling and screaming, and the Lord Chamberlain saying he ought to censor them because they were so radical, so shocking. So it's up to us through things like the gala, and Daniel is a perfect director to do this, to recapture whatever it was, what it must have been like being in the first night of Private Lives. And we're rather attuned to the violence of that play now because we're used to it and we know it and it's terribly funny. And yet imagine seeing it for the first time. You know, the danger of Coward should never be underestimated. That shocking, brave, radical, angry young man side of Coward.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I love about theatrical history is that it's molten and it's moving all the time. So having grown up with very much, Coward and Rattigan being out of fashion and Wesker and Osborne being not so much totally in fashion, because the era I'm growing up is much more people like Trevor Griffiths and so on, but they are the definers of the theatrical oeuvre, really. They're the people who are saying these are the kind of plays we should be watching. They have to be political, they have to be engaged, they have to describe society. And then that discovery of Rattigan and Coward really both, as you say, have a much more variegated history where the oppositions were not as great as you imagine, but also the richness in the text. I mean, I still do find that the violence in Private Lives really shocking, and it's hard to equate in that recent production with Rachel Sterling and Stephen Mangan. It was really hard to equate the anger in it with the comedy. And that's a very interesting tension in Coward, that they are always funny, but there's some shocking things going on.
And that only gets more so. And in that Donmar production, you mentioned, when I saw it for the first time, some of the more extreme choices that had been made in the choreography of the violence. I rushed back to the script and found that everything they had done is there. I mean, it's specifically marked by Coward. They had been more faithful in a way to Coward than I had realized when I first saw it. And again, it's, as Julian said earlier, they get more relevant. They actually become more shocking as time passes.
Yeah, I did exactly the same thing with that. I thought, they made this up. Then went back and had a look. Julian, are there things you're still discovering? I mean, having spent the best part of 2 years engrossed in this material, are there things that you're still discovering about Coward?
Absolutely. And, I think with all great playwrights, you can see different versions of the same play with a different lens on them by different directors and different creative teams, and see something new. I mean, and I think Private Lives we've just talked about is a perfect example of that. Let's just take the two productions in the last year. They had a very different feel, one with a slightly more elderly couple of actors in Patricia Hodge and Nigel Havers gave that play a very different slant. And I will say I happened to see that twice as it happens. I saw it once at a matinee soon after lockdown, when it was one of the first things that went back out in a big scale. I saw it in a matinee at the Marlow Theatre in Canterbury on a Wednesday matinee with a Saturday matinee with 1,000 people. The theatre was absolutely packed watching the two of them. I mean, obviously, and the other three in it do the most extraordinary performance, and to hear the sort of gasps in the audience, as you said, when the sort of violence happens and they're throwing cushions and furniture across the room at each other. And then, you see a much younger group of people, a couple do it at the Donmar, and very different kind of take on it. So I think you're with Shakespeare or anyone, you're constantly exploring and finding new things in it. But I think for me, the great thing has been exploring some of the kind of standalone songs or the poems as well, which, and seeing the kind of complete relevance in it. I didn't really know the song Why Do the Wrong People Travel, but you could almost write the lyrics down on Twitter and it would be perfect for a lot that you see online. I mean, it's so extraordinary that the relevance to me of a lot that was written. You're talking 2030s, really, all of that. Those things were written, and you're talking 100 years ago, pretty much, and yet here we are saying, "Wow, it could have been written yesterday." And I think for me, that's been a little bit of the joy of all of this. Actually, is uncovering that, and I, it's hard to imagine somebody else who wrote songs and poetry and plays from 100 years ago that we're still talking about in this way.
Yeah. I suspect Noel Coward might have liked TikTok, actually. I feel that he would have been a natural child of the TikTok generation.
Yeah, and as Oliver said, we're talking about this long period ago. It's hard to imagine, in one sense, he was completely radical in his work with the LGBT privately and everything that he did there, and really very publicly wrote about and taking huge risks with that. If you think, a lot of that we fortunately slightly take for granted today, and certainly playwrights who write for the stage are able to write completely freely in that way. But, the risks that were taken at the time around all of that is sort of quite daring, actually.
I mean, you use that acronym LGBT. It's worth saying that the G, the use of the word gay to mean homosexual, the Oxford English Dictionary lists coward as the first attested use of it in his operetta Bittersweet. So we're talking about someone who's actually moulding the language under the secretive cloak of satire, so to speak. I mean, it's important social history on top of everything else, as theatre so often is. It's actually changing the world that we live in and talk about today. It's astonishing.
Yeah, it is. And also, I do think that sense of the wealth that you're choosing from and the fact that there is still things being discovered is interesting. Are there things, Oliver, is there one thing that you'd really like to see revived or rediscovered about Coward that we haven't managed to get to in his anniversary? Yeah,
the gala, all being well, because a lot can happen, but I think it is pretty set in stone. If we can mention it, is going to have a world premiere of a newly discovered scene. I think the last thing Coward wrote that's never been staged. So that is exciting in itself, to actually still be finding things that are having their premiere. But on a larger scale, things that we haven't been able to fit in. I do want someone to look again at this early play called Postmortem, which is set in the trenches of the First World War, and then as a young soldier is dying, he time slips like a play out of something out of J.B. Priestley, but a long time before Priestley, into a future society that is essentially an astonishing prediction of fascist Europe. I mean, it's a play written in the late 20s, early 30s, and it predicts the Nazi Olympic Games and the ethnic cleansing of it and so on. It's an astonishingly prescient, moving, upsetting, entirely unfunny script that Coward rather hid because it wasn't part of his self-created image. But God, with the right cast in a small theatre, that I think has the potential to be so powerful. And there are other plays of that ilk, the plays imagining what would have happened if Hitler had won the war, the plays about affairs in what were called South Sea Islands that he wrote in the 30s that read like Tennessee Williams. I mean, there's a lot there that great actors could really sing with, I think.
Yeah.
Oliver, it's fair also to say that perhaps inevitably some of the most performed are those for small casts, but actually some of his plays have enormous casts and therefore in this day and age are rarely performed. Things like Waiting in the Wings and, some of those which, let's hope we see some kind of versions of them, even if one night versions, in the future. But as you said, he wrote an extraordinary amount of material, extraordinary volume of plays. And actually the ones that are known are 5 or 6, really.
It's 10%. I mean, I'm sitting here with a shelf just to my left. You can't see it. A whole shelf of red spines that I read my way through over years and years and years. I mean, there's so much there and all still waiting to be excavated, I think.
Yeah, well, the National Theatre hasn't done a Coward for a bit, I don't think. So maybe they should take one of the big cast ones. They did very well with Dodie Smith and Dear Octopus. So maybe it's a moment for a huge cast Coward to come in. No, I do feel that the more you see, the more you feel and you understand in Present Laughter, which was I'd never seen and I'd always just thought was a silly play. You know, you put Andrew Scott and Indira Varma in it, and and it's amazing play. So funny, so pertinent.
So yeah,
it's really, if I'm allowed to say, you know, I saw the last version on Broadway of Present Laughter with Kevin Kline in, and then you had Andrew Scott here doing it at the Old Vic. And I mean, two more different versions of a play you could not have seen, and yet the text was identical, you know. Yeah. And whenever I've seen Coward in America, in the main, absent the Angela Lansbury Blythe Spirit, it's played for high laughs. It's almost treated, I think, a little bit like all he wrote was high comedy. And yet when you see it done here by Andrew Scott and Indira Varma and that extraordinary cast at the Old Vic, you get the humour, but once again you realise what's underlying it all. And it was a complete intrigue for me to see how that one play, for example, could be treated so completely differently.
Yeah. Everything you're saying is making me realise how malleable he is. In that
exactly.
one criticism often levelled at him is that you've got to keep him within his period. The set's got to sort of be basically a realistic, lovely, beautifully furnished drawing room. It's not like a play that you can suddenly set in a bathroom or something, or an empty white box. And yet the freedom the actors have within those specifics to take it one way or another actually shows what spaces they have within them, I think.
Yeah. Well, all of this is very much whetting my appetite for your gala on November 17th, Prince of Wales Theatre. Is there anything else you want to say about it, Julian, to bring us to a conclusion?
First of all, you know, my thanks to everyone who's giving up their time to help us with it. I mean, you know, these things are, as you know, they're sort of like huge armies or villages that come together to do these one nights. And I think it's extraordinary that so many people, one, want to support the charities, but two, actually want to celebrate Coward's work. And I hope we'll have a great night and people will be both moved and hugely entertained. And I think that's what we have in progress.
Brilliant.
And what a household across history as well. We've got Derek Jacobi, as Julian says, who was in, as a young actor, the production of Hay Fever in 1964 that brought Coward back into the public eye for his last glorious decade. Yeah. I mean, to do that in one touch, I mean, I will be at Derek Jacobi's feet just thinking we're one step away from working with Coward himself as a director. I mean, it's historic, I think that. It's wonderful.
And we should say we've got some extraordinary people taking part who are recipients of bursaries from the Nol Coward Foundation. So, you know, as Oliver said, we really are spanning the generations ourselves in who we've got involved in the evening.
Oh, it'll be brilliant. I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you both very much for talking to me about it. And that's it for this week's episode of the What's on Stage podcast. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, write to us, stay in touch. But for now, thank you very much to Oliver and Julian for joining me.